It was a cold morning in the small town nestled along the rolling hills of 17th century England. Mist hung low over the cobblestone streets, and the faint smell of smoke from chimneys drifted through the air. People moved about hurriedly, clutching their coats tightly, their faces tense and wary. There was a palpable unease in the air that seemed to settle over the town like a heavy blanket. The town had always been wary of outsiders, and any deviation from what they considered normal was met with suspicion. In a small tavern at the corner of the main square, a group of villagers huddled around a dimly lit fireplace. The tavern keeper, a burly man named Thomas, was polishing a row of wooden mugs while keeping one eye on the door. He had heard whispers, rumors that a traveler had arrived from distant lands, and he felt a knot of worry tighten in his chest. This was not unusual news of strangers, always stirred discomfort. But this traveler was said to practice a faith that most villagers had never encountered: Islam. The villagers, mostly farmers and craftsmen, exchanged cautious glances as they sipped their thick ale. Old Mr. Jenkins, whose long beard had turned silver with age, leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Have you heard? They say he prays 5 times a day, and he doesn't bow to the king. That's not right. Not like us." His words carried a weight that went beyond mere gossip. It was fear rooted deep in tradition, a fear of anything that disrupted the familiar order of life. Mary, the baker's daughter, shook her head. Why would anyone care so much about what he believes? He hasn't done anything to us. But her voice, soft as it was, seemed to vanish into the firelight. Few dared to question the old ways. The villagers had been told for generations that certain beliefs were dangerous, that people who worshipped differently were somehow morally suspect, even a threat to the safety of the town. Outside, the traveler walked slowly, his dark cloak trailing behind him on the wet cobblestones. His name was Ibrahim, and he had traveled hundreds of miles from the bustling cities of the Ottoman Empire, carrying only what he could on his back. The locals watched him from a distance, their eyes narrowing as he approached the marketplace. Children peeked around corners, fascinated by his unfamiliar garb, but quickly ducked when adults called them back. Ibrahim's presence immediately drew attention to the stark differences in culture and religion. He was polite and humble, offering greetings in his native tongue, but few understood him. He needed bread and water, and though he tried to communicate with the villagers, most of them shook their heads or turned away. It was not that they were cruel. It was ignorance and fear that shaped their reactions. Generations had grown up with tales of distant lands where people worshipped differently, and those tales had been twisted into cautionary warnings. The mayor, a stern man named Edward, summoned a meeting that evening in the town hall. The chamber was crowded, and the murmurs of concern filled the room. Edward stood at the front, his hands resting on the edge of a wooden podium. "We have reports," he began, his voice steady but heavy with unease, "of a foreigner residing in our town. He comes from lands unfamiliar to us, and he follows a religion we do not understand. We must decide how to respond." Some villagers nodded in agreement, their faces hardening with suspicion. Others whispered among themselves, unsure of what the correct course of action was. Fear was a powerful force, and in those times, fear often became judgment. Edward continued, "It is not just a matter of personal belief. We have traditions here. We have laws. We cannot allow influences that might disrupt the moral fabric of our community. We must be vigilant. In a small corner of the hall, a young scholar named Samuel raised his hand, his voice trembling slightly. With all due respect, sir, he has harmed no one. Should we not try to understand him before passing judgment? The room fell silent. Few had the courage to speak against the tide of collective fear. Edward's eyes narrowed, and a hush swept over the chamber. Understanding comes later, he said firmly. Safety and order come first. That night, Ibrahim found a place to rest in a small, dilapidated barn on the outskirts of town. The cold seeped through the wooden walls, but he remained calm, kneeling in silent prayer under the dim glow of a lantern. His faith was a source of strength, a reminder of home and family left for behind. But he knew the villagers would not see his devotion as something noble. They would see it as strange, alien, and potentially threatening. Rumors began to spread quickly. People whispered that Ibrahim's prayers summoned storms, that his fasting would bring famine, that his presence would corrupt the youth. These rumors, fueled by fear and misunderstanding, transformed into a narrative of danger. The villagers began to look at the skies nervously, attributing any misfortune, a sick cow, a sudden downpour, a failed harvest, to the foreigner in their midst. One evening, as Ibrahim walked through the marketplace to fetch some vegetables, he was confronted by a group of men led by Thomas. "You shouldn't be here," Thomas said, his tone sharp, his hands gripping a wooden staff. "This town is not for your kind. We've heard things that make us wary of people like you." Ibrahim bowed respectfully, attempting to calm the rising tension. "I mean no harm. I seek only peace and sustenance." But his words fell on ears hardened by generations of caution and prejudice. One man spat on the cobblestone street in contempt. Another whispered, "We cannot trust him." Not one bit. Days passed, and the situation escalated. Villagers avoided him on the streets. Shopkeepers refused to sell him goods. Children were warned not to play near him. The fabric of daily life became a reflection of fear, each glance a judgment, each murmur a condemnation. The sense of community that once existed began to fracture, replaced by suspicion and unease. Even those who were naturally compassionate found themselves caught in the current of collective fear. Mary, the baker's daughter, continued to leave a loaf of bread near the barn each morning. She watched from a distance, her heart aching, yet she dared not approach him openly. She understood, in a way, that the fear was not truly about Ibrahim, but about what he represented, a world unknown and unexamined. Ibrahim's days became a careful routine of quiet survival. He prayed at dawn, walked in solitude to avoid confrontation, and spoke only when necessary. His mind wandered to memories of home, the bustling streets, the call to prayer echoing from distant minarets, the comforting aroma of spices in the air. These memories were bittersweet, for he was acutely aware that his presence here was seen as a threat, rather than a bridge between worlds. One afternoon, a traveler from a neighboring town arrived. He had heard of Ibrahim and was curious. Unlike the villagers, he approached with an open mind. "I've seen him in the fields," he said to Edward, the mayor. "He does no harm. In fact, he tends to the sick and helps where he can." But Edward, reflecting the ingrained fears of the town, responded, "We cannot let kindness blind us to potential danger. Our ways are our safeguard. We cannot risk it." As weeks turned into months, Ibrahim's isolation became more pronounced. He would sit by the river, watching the water ripple and imagining it flowing through cities he would never see again. The town carried on, but the tension lingered, a silent reminder of how fear can dictate behavior and shape perceptions. People were not inherently cruel, yet the story of the stranger, misunderstood and maligned, became a cautionary tale repeated in hushed tones at every gathering. Despite this, Ibrahim remained steadfast. His faith did not waver. It became a quiet defiance, a testament to his resilience. He understood that ignorance and fear often masqueraded as morality, that people's reactions were shaped more by inherited narratives than by his actual character. Each night, as he prayed beneath the stars, he hoped that one day, understanding would replace fear, that curiosity would triumph over prejudice, and that future generations might see faith not as a threat, but as a bridge connecting distant worlds. Weeks passed, and the tension in the town had not eased. The villagers' suspicion had settled into a routine, like a shadow they could not shake. They would talk in whispers about Ibrahim, about the strange rituals they could not comprehend, and about the distant lands from which he had come. Rumors continued to spread how he supposedly refused to bow to their king, how he carried secret messages from unknown powers, and how his religion was dangerous. Fear had become a lens through which they viewed every act of kindness he attempted. Yet, Ibrahim's days were marked by quiet dignity. He spent hours tending to a small patch of land near the barn, planting herbs and vegetables. Though simple, these efforts brought life to the barren soil, and sometimes, if a villager dared to watch, they would notice the care with which he worked. But such moments of curiosity were rare. Most people were too entrenched in fear to see beyond what they had been taught. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the village, Ibrahim was approached by Samuel, the young scholar from the town hall. Samuel had been wrestling with the conflict between what he had been taught and what he could see with his own eyes. He approached cautiously, hesitant yet determined. "Ibrahim," he said softly, "I've been observing you. I can see that you do no harm. In fact, your presence, it brings a certain calmness to the land." Ibrahim looked up, his expression serene. "Thank you," he said in a gentle tone. "I came not to disrupt, but to live peacefully, to contribute where I can." Samuel nodded, absorbing the words. They were simple, yet profound, a reminder that fear often clouded truth. Despite this, the majority of villagers remained skeptical. Thomas and his group had begun organizing regular patrols, insisting that someone needed to watch over the foreigner. Their actions were subtle, almost ritualistic, a reminder of the distrust that had been built over generations. Children were warned not to play near the barn, and even those who sympathized with Ibrahim found themselves speaking cautiously, for fear of being ostracized. One night, a violent storm swept over the village. Thunder roared and lightning lit the sky, shaking the foundations of homes. The villagers whispered that it was a sign, an omen of the danger that Ibrahim represented. Yet, when the storm subsided, they discovered that it had destroyed a section of the barn where Ibrahim had been sheltering. The villagers rushed to help, but Ibrahim refused to see their efforts as charity. "It is not your fault," he said, smiling gently. "The storm comes for all of us. Let us rebuild together." This simple act began to sow seeds of doubt in some hearts. If the foreigner brought kindness even in the wake of fear, perhaps the stories they had been told were not entirely true. Samuel, encouraged by Ibrahim's patience, began speaking quietly to others, recounting observations that contradicted the prevailing narratives. Slowly, tiny cracks appeared in the wall of prejudice, though they were fragile and easily dismissed. As winter approached, Ibrahim found ways to help the villagers without drawing attention to himself. He repaired broken fences, tended to sick animals, and even helped deliver firewood during the cold nights. Though most people still avoided him openly, his presence became increasingly difficult to ignore. The younger villagers, who had grown up hearing only tales of fear, began to question the stories they had been told. Yet, fear is a stubborn force, and the elders of the village clung tightly to their beliefs. At another town hall meeting, Edward, the mayor, spoke with renewed urgency. "We cannot ignore the danger," he said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Our traditions, our way of life, must be preserved. Strange beliefs cannot be allowed to flourish unchecked." Many nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting anxiety rather than malice. Fear, reinforced by authority, had a weight that ordinary persuasion could not easily overcome. One day, a small incident ignited the town's unease anew. A child had wandered near Ibrahim's barn and fallen into the river. Ibrahim had been the first to react, diving in and pulling the boy to safety. Though the child was unharmed, the villagers' interpretation was distorted. "He lured the boy," Thomas whispered to others. "He has powers we cannot understand. Who knows what could happen next?" The irony was not lost on Samuel, who observed the scene with frustration. Acts of heroism became twisted into proof of danger when filtered through fear. Despite the hostility, Ibrahim remained a model of patience and compassion. He taught himself the local language more fluently, hoping to bridge the gap between himself and the villagers. He would smile at those who feared him, offer a gentle nod to those who avoided him, and pray silently for those who could not understand his faith. In these small gestures, he carried the weight of centuries of misunderstanding and prejudice, embodying a resilience that was both quiet and profound. The turning point, however, came when a serious illness swept through the village. Crops failed, livestock fell ill, and people grew weak with fever. Panic rose as the villagers searched desperately for solutions. Ibrahim, who had studied herbal remedies in his homeland, began tending to the sick in secret. He brought herbs and prepared infusions, working tirelessly through the night. Slowly, the village began to recover, and the truth of his intentions became undeniable. Even so, acceptance was far from complete. The villagers were conflicted, their fear intermingled with gratitude. Some openly thanked him, while others whispered suspicions, unable to reconcile the kindness they had witnessed with the narrative they had been taught. It was a slow, uneven process, a fragile awakening that took root in moments of quiet observation rather than grand declarations. Through the winter, Ibrahim continued to live with humility, never seeking recognition or reward. His life became a study in perseverance, a testament to the power of patience and the strength of belief. He showed, day by day, that fear could be met with understanding, that prejudice could be softened by empathy, and that one's faith, no matter how misunderstood, could coexist with a community that initially resisted it. By the end of the season, A subtle shift had begun. The youngest children would watch him from a distance, fascinated rather than fearful. A few of the villagers began to leave small offerings, loaves of bread, fresh vegetables, or bundles of firewood outside his shelter. It was not full acceptance, but it was a beginning. It was a quiet acknowledgement that the world could be more than the narrow boundaries of fear and ignorance. Ibrahim often reflected on these moments as he prayed under the stars. He knew the journey was far from over. The majority of villagers still held tightly to their beliefs, and prejudice lingered like an unseen shadow. Yet, he also understood that change often began in small, imperceptible ways. One act of kindness, one gesture of patience, one life saved at a time, could challenge the narratives that generations had clung to. In the heart of the village, amidst the cold winds and the whispers of fear, a story of resilience and quiet defiance was unfolding. Ibrahim's presence was no longer just a source of suspicion, it was a living lesson, an invitation for people to see beyond inherited fears and encounter the truth for themselves. And though the path ahead remained uncertain, the seeds of understanding had been sown, waiting patiently to grow. Spring arrived slowly, almost hesitantly, as if the earth itself was cautious after the long, harsh winter. The hills surrounding the village began to soften with green shoots, and the river swelled with melting snow. Birds returned, filling the air with unfamiliar songs that seemed to echo the restless energy building within the town. Yet, the villagers' hearts remained guarded. Even as nature renewed itself, old fears persisted stubbornly in their minds, like roots twisting through stone. Ibrahim, however, embraced the change with quiet optimism. Each morning, he would step outside his modest shelter to tend to the small garden he had nurtured over the winter. Tiny shoots of herbs and vegetables poked through the soil, fragile but determined. To Ibrahim, they were a metaphor for the possibility of growth even in the hardest conditions. Every plant he tended reminded him of the patience his faith demanded, and the resilience of the human spirit. The villagers watched him from a distance, some secretly, some openly. Their curiosity was tinged with fear, but there was also admiration they could not acknowledge. Children would peek through the gaps in fences, whispering to one another about the foreigner who worked tirelessly while remaining calm, as if the storms of suspicion surrounding him could not touch his resolve. But the elders, still clinging to ingrained caution, warned them, "Do not follow him. He is not like us. His ways are not our ways." One afternoon, as Ibrahim carried water from the river to nourish his garden, he noticed a woman sitting alone beneath a large oak tree near the outskirts of the village. Her name was Eliza, a widow whose husband had passed the previous winter, leaving her with 2 young children and a house in disrepair. She had observed Ibrahim's quiet efforts for weeks, her curiosity slowly overcoming the fear that had been instilled in her by years of tradition. Tentatively, she spoke. "I see what you do. The garden, the animals, the work you put in. Why do you help when most would avoid you?" Ibrahim turned to her, his eyes reflecting the calm warmth that had begun to touch a few hearts in the village. "Because life is fragile," he said softly. "Because fear should not guide our actions. We are responsible for kindness, even when it is unrecognized." Eliza considered his words carefully. For the first time, she felt a flicker of hope, not just in the stranger, but in the possibility that the world could be larger than the boundaries her upbringing had imposed. She nodded slowly. I want to help too. That simple declaration, made in a quiet moment, was a ripple that would slowly touch others. As the days grew longer, Ibrahim's presence began to subtly change the rhythm of the village. He would repair broken carts for the farmers, share herbal remedies, and even help mend roofs damaged by winter storms. Each act, small though it might seem, became a testament to his integrity. Slowly, people began to notice that his faith was not a threat, but a source of moral strength. Yet not all hearts were swayed. Thomas, the tavern keeper, still regarded Ibrahim with suspicion, believing that the foreigner's influence might erode the traditions the town had clung to for centuries. One evening, Thomas confronted Ibrahim as he returned from gathering firewood. "You think your deeds make you welcome here?" he asked, his voice low and sharp. "Our town has rules. Our ways must be followed." Ibrahim paused, considering the man before him. He did not respond with anger or indignation. "I do not seek to change your ways," he said gently. "I seek only to live among you peacefully and to help where I can. If my actions challenge fear, that is a lesson I do not impose but offer freely." Thomas stared, the words settling uneasily in his mind. They did not disarm him immediately, but they planted a seed of doubt, a recognition that not all deviations from tradition were dangerous. Fear, after all, could be questioned. Slowly and with persistence. As spring unfolded fully, the village began to experience subtle transformations. Children who had once avoided Ibrahim now approached cautiously, drawn by curiosity and the kindness they observed in him. A young boy named Henry, whose father had died in the previous winter, began helping Ibrahim in the garden, asking questions about the herbs and how they grew. The boy's fascination spread quietly, unnoticed by many of the adults who remained bound by fear. Even the animals seemed to sense the difference. Stray dogs and cats that had once fled at the sight of villagers now lingered near Ibrahim's barn, trusting in his calm demeanor. Birds nested nearby, their songs blending with the sound of the river and the rustle of leaves, creating a living symphony that marked the village's slow awakening to the presence of someone who, though different, was fundamentally good. Despite these signs of hope, challenges persisted. One day, a traveling preacher arrived from a distant town. He was a fiery man, speaking of dangers in the world beyond the village and warning of influences that could corrupt the faithful. His words, laced with fear, spread quickly, reigniting whispers and doubt. "Do not be fooled," he proclaimed at the marketplace. "Strangers bring temptation and chaos. We must guard our hearts and our traditions." For a time, Ibrahim's influence seemed fragile. Villagers wavered, caught between admiration for his deeds and the fear instilled by centuries of inherited narratives. Samuel, the young scholar, spoke to the people tirelessly, recounting his observations of Ibrahim's consistent kindness. "Look beyond stories," he urged. "See with your own eyes. He harms no one. He teaches only through example." This battle between inherited fear and observed truth became the defining struggle of the season. The village existed in a tension between caution and curiosity, suspicion and admiration. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, some began to recognize that the fear they had carried for generations might have been misplaced. Their worldview, carefully constructed over decades, began to show cracks. Ibrahim, meanwhile, continued his routine undisturbed. He understood that change in human hearts was not sudden, but gradual. Each act of kindness, each moment of patience was a stone laid in the foundation of understanding. And though he knew not all would accept him, he remained steadfast, embodying the principle that true faith is demonstrated not through argument, but through lived example. As spring gave way to summer, the air in the village shifted subtly. Children played near the barn under watchful eyes. Adults began to leave offerings of thanks, and even Thomas, though resistant, found himself questioning the stories he had always trusted. The first cracks of acceptance appeared in small gestures, quiet moments of recognition that perhaps the world was not as narrow as it had been taught to be. In these quiet days, Ibrahim often reflected by the river. The water flowed steadily, indifferent to fear or judgment, and in its calm persistence, he saw a mirror of his own faith and patience. Change, he realized, was like the river, slow, unrelenting, and unstoppable in its own time. And though the village still wrestled with doubt and inherited suspicion, the seeds of understanding had begun to grow, promising a future where fear might finally yield to curiosity and prejudice to compassion. Summer stretched across the village with long, golden days and evenings filled with the hum of insects and the soft scent of blooming flowers. The air was thick with warmth, yet beneath the surface, old anxieties still lingered. Buried under the day-to-day routines of life, the villagers were learning, slowly, that Ibrahim's presence did not herald danger, but fear remained a shadow, subtle and persistent. Ibrahim continued his quiet work in the fields, caring for crops and animals. His hands, calloused from labor, moved with gentle precision. Whether planting seeds or tending to a sick goat, villagers who had once avoided him at all costs now stole glances from the corners of their eyes, curiosity mixing with lingering caution. It was a delicate balance, a dance between recognition and inherited suspicion. One afternoon, while Ibrahim repaired a section of the town's water mill that had been damaged by the spring floods, a small group of villagers gathered nearby. Among them was Eliza, who had become one of his few confidants, her initial curiosity blossoming into genuine respect. "Ibrahim," she said, brushing a bead of sweat from her forehead, "why do you persist? After all the whispers, all the fear, why not leave and find a place where people do not judge so harshly?" Ibrahim paused, setting down his tools. The sunlight reflected off the metal of the mill, glinting like a small sign of hope. "Because fear cannot teach," he replied softly, "but patience, understanding, and action can. If I leave, then nothing changes. People will continue to fear what they do not know. I stay to show them otherwise." His words seemed to resonate quietly, not just with Eliza, but with the few who overheard. The principle of living by example, of demonstrating faith and morality through deeds rather than rhetoric, was something unfamiliar, but compelling to the villagers. It challenged their preconceptions without confronting them directly. A subtle, almost imperceptible form of teaching. That evening, a festival was being prepared in the village to celebrate the end of the summer planting. The mayor, Edward, insisted that the celebration adhere strictly to local customs, wary of allowing foreign influence to infiltrate the traditions. Yet, through the preparations, Ibrahim was quietly helpful. He repaired benches, carried water, and even helped decorate with simple greenery he had gathered from the hills. His contributions went unnoticed by many, but they did not go unappreciated by those who had begun to see him with new eyes. Meanwhile, Thomas remained vigilant. He noticed the subtle changes with unease. Children played near Ibrahim's garden. Some villagers quietly thanked him for his help. "It's dangerous," Thomas muttered to a friend one evening. "If he gains their trust, next thing you know, they'll start following his ways. We cannot let that happen." Fear and suspicion, deeply rooted, still held strong in the hearts of the older generation, yet small gestures began to build bridges. Samuel, the young scholar, had started inviting a few villagers to observe Ibrahim's methods, how he treated the animals, how he cultivated the herbs, and how he tended to the sick with knowledge from his homeland. "See for yourselves," Samuel would say. "He harms no one. His faith teaches compassion, and his actions reflect it." These sessions, often in whispers and behind closed doors, began to plant seeds of doubt about the old narratives of fear. One day, Ibrahim was approached by Henry, the young boy who had become his occasional helper. Henry's eyes were wide with wonder. "Ibrahim," he asked, "why do you always pray so calmly, even when people are afraid or angry at you?" Ibrahim knelt to the boy's level, brushing the dirt from his hands. "Prayer," he explained, "is not about the world around us, but about the world within us. It teaches patience, peace, and understanding. When we carry these qualities, fear loses its power over our hearts." Henry nodded slowly, absorbing the meaning. In that small exchange, a generation-long cycle of fear began to be interrupted, not through force or argument, but through lived example and quiet teaching. The child's eyes, curious and unafraid, became a symbol of what could be achieved when understanding overcame prejudice. As the festival approached, tension lingered. Edward, the mayor, spoke to the townsfolk before the celebrations began. "We must remain vigilant," he warned, "even in celebration. Remember our customs and traditions." Yet, despite his warnings, the villagers could not ignore Ibrahim's presence. His calm dedication, his unwavering kindness, and the subtle, consistent acts of care for the community had begun to erode the fear that had once ruled their hearts. During the festival, as laughter and music filled the streets, a small but meaningful shift occurred. A few villagers, emboldened by months of observing Ibrahim's deeds, approached him with offerings: a basket of fresh eggs, a bouquet of wildflowers, a loaf of bread. The gestures were quiet, respectful, and yet powerful in their symbolism. They were a tacit acknowledgement that the man they had feared was not a threat, but a contributor to the life of the village. Even Thomas, though he refused to participate openly, could not deny the change. He saw children smiling near Ibrahim, villagers quietly speaking words of thanks, and a subtle calm settling over the marketplace that had previously been tense and wary. Slowly, he began to question the narratives he had held so tightly for decades. Fear was still present, but it was no longer absolute. It was being challenged, one act of kindness at a time. Ibrahim's summer passed quietly, marked by hard work, patient observation, and small victories in the hearts of the villagers. He understood that true change was never immediate, that fear could linger for generations, and that acceptance was often gradual. Yet, each moment of curiosity, each act of trust from the villagers, was a step toward breaking the cycle of suspicion that had dominated their lives for so long. As the sun set over the hills, casting long, golden shadows over the town, Ibrahim knelt by the river, reflecting on the progress made. The water, flowing steadily and patiently, mirrored the path of understanding he had taken. Change, he realized, was not a dramatic event, but a continuous, steady effort of river carving its way through stone. Imperceptible at first, but undeniable over time. And in the village, beneath the twilight sky, this subtle but growing presence of acceptance marked the beginning of a transformation. Fear would not vanish entirely, not yet. But, for the first time, the villagers were beginning to glimpse what it meant to see beyond inherited prejudice, to recognize the humanity in someone who had once been wholly other, and to understand that faith, when lived with integrity and compassion, could bridge divides rather than create them. The first light of dawn crept over the hills surrounding the village, spilling gold and pink across the fields and rooftops. The mist lingered like a gentle veil over the cobblestone streets, carrying the scent of dew-drenched grass and fresh bread from early morning bakers. Even in these tranquil hours, the village was a mixture of life and tension, a community caught between the old fears that had guided generations and the slow emergence of understanding that Ibrahim's presence had begun to inspire. Ibrahim rose before the sun, as was his custom, kneeling on a simple mat outside the small barn that had become his home. The air was cool, the birds chirping their uncertain songs as if testing the new day. He prayed quietly, his movements precise yet gentle, invoking the calm patience that had carried him through months of suspicion and isolation. To an observer, his prayers were a study in discipline and serenity. To him, they were the foundation upon which he built every interaction, every decision, every effort to bridge the gap between his faith and the world that viewed it with suspicion. After prayers, he walked to the garden, a small but flourishing plot of herbs, vegetables, and flowers he had nurtured since his arrival. Each plant had become a small companion, a symbol of growth in the face of neglect or misunderstanding. The soil was soft from the morning dew, and Ibrahim's hands worked rhythmically, carefully inspecting the shoots, pulling weeds, and watering each row with attentiveness. It was meditative work, a reminder that patience was not passive, but active. That care given without expectation of reward could transform even the harshest environment. The village was slowly stirring. Smoke from chimneys curled into the sky as villagers began their daily routines. Children ran along the streets, their laughter carrying across the marketplace and filling the empty corners where fear had once dwelled. Some of these children, curious and bold, approached the edges of Ibrahim's garden. They watched silently, captivated by the unfamiliar shapes of plants, the care with which he tended to each sprout. Occasionally, a child would inch closer, offering a small gift, a shiny pebble, a fallen flower, test of trust that Ibrahim always accepted with a soft smile. Eliza appeared first, carrying a basket of eggs and a small bundle of herbs she had grown herself. Her eyes were cautious but bright, reflecting both curiosity and admiration. "Ibrahim," she said softly, "I have been watching the garden, the care you give. It is remarkable. The villagers are beginning to notice. Some are even speaking of you in kind words, though most are still quiet. Ibrahim looked up from the soil, his expression serene. "Change is slow," he replied gently. "The heart must open gradually. Fear cannot be hurried, but understanding can grow, if given time and example." Eliza nodded, inspired by his patience. "I wish more would see as you do. There is so much fear here, so many stories we've been told about strangers and their ways. I fear it will take years for real understanding to take root." "Perhaps," Ibrahim said, "but the seed is planted, and that is what matters. One small act of kindness, one moment of trust, can grow in ways we cannot yet imagine." As the day progressed, Ibrahim tended not only to the garden, but to small tasks across the village. He repaired a broken cart for a farmer whose back had been injured, fetched water for the elderly widow whose well had dried, and even helped gather firewood for the families struggling to keep their homes warm during unexpected summer chills. Every act was quiet, deliberate, and free of expectation. Each interaction, no matter how brief, carried a lesson of patience and resilience, subtly challenging the ingrained fears that had governed the villagers for generations. Despite these efforts, tension lingered among certain residents. Thomas, the tavern keeper, remained skeptical. He paced the shadows near the marketplace, watching Ibrahim with narrowed eyes. "Do you see?" he whispered to a friend one morning. "They may accept him slowly, but his influence grows. And where does it end? What other customs will we be asked to accept? He is different, and we cannot ignore that." Yet, even Thomas began to notice subtle changes he could not fully explain. Children, once wary, now played near Ibrahim without fear. Some women left small gifts at the edge of his garden, tokens of acknowledgement for his help and compassion. Even a few men, though hesitant, began to speak quietly of his deeds, questioning the assumptions they had inherited without scrutiny. Ibrahim's relationship with the villagers continued to develop in delicate, almost imperceptible ways. Samuel, the young scholar, had become his closest ally among the townsfolk, observing every act, documenting each instance of kindness, and sharing these accounts quietly to shift perception. "It is not enough to argue," Samuel would say. "We must show them the truth through action." Ibrahim embodies the principles he teaches. People may fear stories, but they cannot fear what they see with their own eyes. One afternoon, the village was thrown into turmoil when a traveler arrived from a distant town. He was loud, brash, and full of warnings about the dangers of strangers. "Strange faiths lead to chaos," he proclaimed in the marketplace. "Do not let him corrupt your children, your families, your way of life." The villagers murmured nervously, and some older residents nodded in agreement. Fear, deeply rooted, surged momentarily, threatening to undo months of careful progress. Ibrahim observed quietly, unshaken. He understood that fear would always rise to meet uncertainty, but he also knew that consistent, compassionate action had a stronger weight than words alone. That evening, he visited the children who had been frightened by the traveler's warnings. Sitting by the river, he explained patiently, in simple terms, the principles of his faith, not as doctrine to be imposed, but as a philosophy of peace, understanding, and respect. The children listened, their wide eyes absorbing the calm certainty in his voice, their curiosity gradually overcoming the planted fear. Eliza joined him, holding the hands of her children, offering quiet support. "Ibrahim," she said softly, even with the fears. You give them something stronger, a reason to think, to question, to understand. That is worth more than any argument the traveler could make. Night fell, and the village settled under a canopy of stars. Ibrahim knelt near his garden, reflecting on the day. The world, he realized, was a mixture of fear and hope, ignorance and understanding. Every act of compassion was a small rebellion against inherited prejudice. Every patient interaction a step toward breaking cycles of suspicion that had persisted for generations. Weeks turned into months, summer progressed, and the villagers began to adjust. The patterns of fear did not vanish entirely, they lingered in whispers, in cautious glances. But the acts of kindness and patience Ibrahim modeled created ripples that slowly expanded. He shared knowledge of medicine and agriculture, helped mend broken homes, and continued to teach through example. Children imitated his care for animals. Women began adopting his methods for gardening, and even the hesitant few started leaving small tokens of gratitude. During this period, a significant event tested the community. A sudden illness struck the village, affecting both humans and livestock. Panic and fear rose immediately. Some villagers blamed Ibrahim, citing old rumors and the danger of foreign influence. But Ibrahim responded not with anger, but with action. He treated the sick, prepared herbal remedies, organized care for the children, and personally assisted the elders. His calm efficiency and undeniable competence gradually turned suspicion into acknowledgement. Villagers who had feared him began to see the truth of his intentions, realizing that fear alone could not account for his consistent goodness. Samuel documented the events meticulously, noting how perceptions were changing subtly, but irrevocably. He recorded instances of villagers stepping forward to assist under Ibrahim's guidance, of children following his methods, and even of Thomas showing moments of hesitation in his own skepticism. Change was slow, but it was tangible, rooted in the lived experiences of the people rather than abstract arguments taught. By the end of summer, the village had begun a transformation. Fear had not vanished, but it had softened. Stories of Ibrahim were no longer solely tales of suspicion. They included acts of heroism, compassion, and patience. People began to speak of him in quiet admiration, some with cautious reverence, others with simple respect. Even those who held tightly to old prejudices found themselves challenged by the undeniable truth. Ibrahim had come not to harm, but to serve, and his faith, once feared, had become a source of moral strength visible to all who would observe. And so, as the sun set over the rolling hills, casting long, warm shadows over the village, Ibrahim knelt once more by the river. The water flowed steadily, reflecting the golden light of evening. In its calm persistence, he saw a mirror of his own journey, slow, patient, and enduring. The villagers were changing, their hearts opening incrementally. And while fear would always linger in some corners, understanding was growing. One act of kindness at a time, the seeds he had planted, both in the soil of the garden and in the hearts of the villagers, were beginning to take root. And Ibrahim, quietly steadfast, remained the living testament that patience, compassion, and faith could bridge the deepest divides, even in a place long bound by fear. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the village and surrounding hills with shades of amber, ochre, and deep crimson. The air carried a chill, reminding the villagers that summer's warmth had ended, and that life, like the seasons, was ever-changing. The river, once swollen with spring's meltwater, now flowed calmly, reflecting the crisp blue of the sky. Its gentle murmur seemed to mirror the rhythm Ibrahim had instilled in the village, steady, enduring, and full of subtle influence. Ibrahim had adjusted to the seasonal changes as seamlessly as he had adjusted to life among the villagers. Every day, he rose before dawn, performed his prayers with unwavering calm, and walked through the village, tending to those in need. His routine, once unfamiliar and even frightening to the villagers, had now become a quiet part of their lives. Children expected to see him working in the fields. Women noticed the care he showed to the livestock, and even the wary men began to acknowledge the consistency of his presence. Yet change was never absolute. Thomas, still vigilant, patrolled the village streets, eyes scanning for what he perceived as danger. "Do not forget," he whispered to a friend in the tavern one evening. "He is not like us. Do not let kindness blind you to that. We have traditions for a reason." Despite his warnings, Thomas could not entirely deny what he was seeing. The village had begun to respect Ibrahim's presence, if only subtly. Children played near his garden, villagers accepted his help without complaint, and the sick were treated, healed, and returned home. The contrast between fear and observable goodness was impossible to ignore. Eliza, who had become one of Ibrahim's closest confidants, observed these changes with a mix of hope and caution. One morning, she approached him while he repaired a small fence near the barn. "Ibrahim," she said softly, "people are beginning to see you for who you are. The children speak of you with admiration. Some adults leave food and gifts without telling anyone. Even Thomas. He watches, perhaps grudgingly, but he watches." Ibrahim nodded, his gaze calm and measured. "Change is slow," he said. "Fear is not easily erased, but actions speak louder than words. The seeds of understanding may grow quietly, unnoticed at first, but they take root eventually. What matters is consistency, patience, compassion, and integrity. Those cannot be denied, no matter how deeply fear is rooted." That evening, the village gathered for the harvest festival, a tradition that celebrated the end of the agricultural season. Edward, the mayor, insisted that the festival adhere strictly to local customs. But he could not deny Ibrahim's presence in organizing and assisting the event. Ibrahim helped repair benches, set up stalls, and even guided children in collecting fallen fruits. His actions were natural, unassuming, yet they commanded respect. The festival was a turning point. Villagers who had once whispered doubts now watched as Ibrahim moved among them, assisting without seeking recognition. His steady calmness contrasted sharply with the chaotic excitement of the festival, drawing attention not by words, but by example. Children followed his instructions when playing harvest games, learning not just about the tasks at hand, but about the value of patience, precision, and care. Even Thomas noticed subtle shifts he could not fully articulate. He watched from the tavern doorway, his arms crossed, observing villagers offering small tokens of appreciation to Ibrahim. Some spoke words of gratitude in whispers, others, quietly, in more open tones. Fear was still present, but it was no longer the dominant force. It had been challenged, and the cracks were becoming visible. Ibrahim's presence had begun to alter the social fabric of the village in other ways too. Families who had struggled with division found common ground through his assistance. Elders who had relied solely on fear and tradition now saw value in observation and reason. A quiet dialogue began to emerge between generations, centered not on dogma, but on shared experience. Ibrahim did not preach, he demonstrated. In doing so, he became an unspoken mediator, bridging gaps not through confrontation, but through consistent example. One evening, a young woman named Margaret approached Ibrahim while he was tending to a sick cow. "Ibrahim," she said, her voice hesitant, "you have changed the way I see things. I had been taught to fear what I do not understand. But seeing you, helping, caring, teaching without judgment, I realize that fear is only a story we tell ourselves. You show another way." Ibrahim smiled gently. "That is all I can do, show another way. Each person must decide for themselves, but even small acts can open hearts. Fear does not vanish instantly, but understanding grows quietly through example." Meanwhile, Edward, the mayor, began to reflect on the months that had passed. He could not deny that Ibrahim's presence had prevented several minor disasters. Livestock were healthier, crops were thriving under his guidance, and children were learning skills that would serve them for years. Even as he clung to caution, he began to allow small acts of trust, permitting Ibrahim to assist in official matters related to the community's welfare. Autumn deepened, bringing colder nights and longer shadows. Ibrahim continued his work undeterred. He repaired roofs, helped collect firewood, and continued tending the garden that had become a symbol of patience and growth. Villagers began to seek his counsel quietly, asking for advice on farming, healing, and daily tasks. What had once been fear-driven avoidance transformed gradually into reliance, though no one claimed it openly. The true test of Ibrahim's influence came when a severe storm hit the village. Winds tore through the streets, rain flooded basements, and lightning struck trees. Panic and fear spread quickly, particularly among the elders, who had long associated strange events with foreign influence. Yet, Ibrahim acted without hesitation. He coordinated relief efforts, guided villagers to safety, assisted the sick, and repaired damage wherever possible. His calm leadership contrasted sharply with the chaos, demonstrating not only practical skill, but moral authority grounded in compassion. After the storm passed, gratitude began to surface more openly. Families thanked him directly, children embraced him with trust rather than fear, and even some of the older villagers, though reserved, nodded in acknowledgement. The combination of action and integrity had begun to erode the last vestiges of suspicion. During a quiet evening by the river, Ibrahim reflected on the months that had passed. The village was still imperfect. Fear still lingered in corners of the hearts of some, but a transformation had begun. He understood that patience and kindness, when practiced consistently, had the power to reshape perceptions, to challenge generations of inherited prejudice, and to create a foundation for understanding where suspicion once ruled. Eliza joined him, carrying a small basket of freshly baked bread. "You have done more than anyone could have imagined," she said softly. "Even those who still fear, you cannot deny the good you bring. I see it in the children, in the families, in the way we now speak to one another. You have planted seeds that will grow long after we are gone." Ibrahim accepted the bread with a nod, his eyes reflecting the fading sunlight on the river. "The seeds are not mine alone," he said. "They grow in the hearts of those willing to look beyond fear. I only tend the soil and water them with patience and consistency. What blossoms is the work of all who choose to see, rather than react blindly." The villagers' slow shift continued as winter approached. Fear still existed, but it was tempered by direct experience and observed goodness. Even Thomas, though never openly friendly, had begun to leave tools and small tokens near Ibrahim's work area, signs of begrudging respect. Samuel, the young scholar, recorded these moments meticulously, understanding that the gradual change of hearts was more powerful than any argument or sermon. By the end of autumn, Ibrahim's influence was undeniable. Children played freely around his garden, villagers sought his advice and assistance, and the community began to recognize that fear need not govern behavior. The lessons he imparted were not spoken, but lived through patience, compassion, and integrity. The narrative that once defined him as a dangerous outsider was slowly being replaced with one of respect and cautious admiration. As the first snowflakes began to fall, covering the hills and streets in a delicate white blanket, Ibrahim knelt once more beside the river. He watched the water flow beneath the ice-forming surface, thinking of the village, of the hearts he had touched, and of the work that remained. Change, he knew, was gradual. Fear would always linger, but understanding could grow stronger than any prejudice, if tended with care, patience, and unwavering goodness. In the quiet of the winter evening, under the emerging stars, Ibrahim's presence was no longer merely tolerated. It was slowly woven into the fabric of village life, and though the path ahead remained long, he understood that the foundations of trust, once planted and nurtured, could endure far beyond the storms of suspicion, shaping generations to come. Winter had settled fully over the village, blanketing the hills and cobblestone streets in thick snow. The river, once a steady stream, had slowed under a fragile layer of ice, its gentle murmur muffled by the cold. The villagers moved cautiously through the streets, their breath visible in the crisp air, and their conversations hushed as if the winter itself had imposed a reflective silence. In the midst of this stillness, Ibrahim continued his quiet presence, a constant thread in a tapestry of fear, curiosity, and slowly emerging trust. Each morning, Ibrahim rose before dawn, performing his prayers with the same measured care he had demonstrated since his arrival. The snow crunched softly under his feet as he walked toward the barn, tending to his modest garden, now partially covered by frost. Even the smallest watering plants carefully shielded from the cold. Feeding the animals with patience became a lesson in endurance and resilience for anyone observing. Eliza approached him that morning, her hands clasped together as she tucked a scarf around her neck. "Ibrahim," she said softly, her breath forming a visible cloud in the winter air. "Even with the snow, the cold, the fear that still lingers, you continue. Why? Why do you not grow weary?" Ibrahim paused, looking at the frost-covered shoots of his herbs. "Because patience is stronger than fear," he said, his voice calm yet resolute. "Fear may freeze hearts, but consistent action thaws it. Understanding does not arrive suddenly, it grows quietly, beneath layers of doubt and suspicion." The children, now accustomed to his presence, approached him slowly, their mittens clumsy in the snow. Henry, the boy who had first assisted him in the garden, carried a small bundle of firewood. "Ibrahim," he said, his voice shy but earnest, "we wanted to help. We saw how hard you work even when it is cold. Can we carry this for you?" Ibrahim smiled, taking the bundle with care. "Thank you, Henry. Every act of care, no matter how small, matters. You learn not only to help others, but to grow stronger yourself. That is the true lesson of compassion." Meanwhile, tension remained in certain corners of the village. Thomas still observed from a distance, his skepticism deepened by the traditions he had long upheld. "Do you see what is happening?" he muttered to a friend in the tavern. "The villagers follow him. They trust him. They forget that he is not like us. Mark my words, it will lead to trouble." Yet, even as he spoke, he could not ignore the quiet acknowledgement creeping into the villagers' behavior, the small gestures of acceptance that were impossible to deny. Ibrahim's influence continued to extend beyond mere acts of kindness. He taught practical skills: how to preserve vegetables for winter, how to create herbal remedies for minor ailments, and how to care for livestock efficiently. These lessons, grounded in utility and compassion, slowly earned him a place in the daily rhythm of village life. Even the most wary adults began to approach him for advice, if only hesitantly. One particularly harsh evening, a blizzard swept through the village. The winds howled, carrying snow in blinding sheets, and the villagers were trapped in their homes. Anxious and fearful, a sudden crisis rose. A young mother named Agnes had gone into labor in the middle of the storm. Panic surged through her family, who had no experience handling childbirth in such severe conditions. The local midwife, elderly and frail, was unable to reach the house due to the snowdrifts. Fear gripped the community. Rumors of danger, superstition, and distant misfortune spread quickly. Ibrahim, alerted by the situation, wrapped himself against the cold and moved swiftly through the storm. His calm determination contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding him. He reached Agnes' home, speaking soothingly to the panicked family, directing them with gentle authority and preparing the space for the birth. By firelight and candle, he guided the mother, provided reassurance, and drew on his knowledge of healing and care. Hours passed, the storm raging outside, but inside that small house, a new life entered the world. The cries of the baby, pure and strong, cut through the tension and fear like a bell of hope. When the mother and child were safe, the family knelt, expressing gratitude that went beyond words. Even some of the skeptical villagers who had been observing discreetly were moved to tears. This single act, witnessed by many, reshaped perceptions profoundly. Fear had given way to awe, not of supernatural power, but of undeniable skill, compassion, and unwavering patience. Edward, the mayor, now found himself in an uncomfortable position. The practical and moral authority of Ibrahim had become evident. The village could no longer dismiss him without contradiction. Edward summoned a council meeting to discuss the implications. The chamber was filled with villagers, some nervous, others hesitant, and a few cautiously hopeful. "We have witnessed," Edward began, faltering slightly, "the assistance, the care. It is undeniable. We cannot ignore the impact. Yet tradition remains, and we must tread carefully." Samuel, ever the voice of reason and observation, spoke next. "We cannot judge him by stories or fear. We must judge by what we have seen with our own eyes. Ibrahim's presence has saved lives, improved our livelihoods, and shown consistent compassion. These actions cannot be dismissed as coincidence or deception. His words resonated through the hall, drawing nods and murmurs of agreement from the younger villagers, who had experienced Ibrahim's guidance firsthand. Thomas, however, remained defiant, though less certain. "It is still dangerous," he insisted. "We cannot fully trust what we do not understand. There is a risk." Yet, even as he spoke, the evidence of Ibrahim's character was irrefutable to all but the most rigid minds. The villagers had begun to see a broader truth. Actions, over time, could outweigh fear, prejudice, and superstition. Over the following weeks, Ibrahim's role in the village continued to solidify. Families sought his advice for winter preparations. Children assisted him in tasks, and the community began to collaborate more effectively under his quiet guidance. His methods, grounded in faith, patience, and practical knowledge, became models for behavior that bridged gaps between generations and challenged the narratives of inherited fear. One evening, as the first snow settled permanently over the village, Ibrahim sat beside the fire in Eliza's home. Villagers had gathered, some hesitantly, some openly, sharing warmth and conversation. The atmosphere was a blend of caution and tentative trust, a reflection of the subtle but undeniable transformation taking place. Children played nearby, laughing freely for the first time in months, while adults engaged in quiet dialogue, often referencing Ibrahim's guidance and example. Ibrahim's presence had become a stabilizing force, a living testament to the idea that consistent compassion, patience, and integrity could change even the most fearful hearts. The village, once dominated by suspicion and rumor, now began to function as a community strengthened by understanding rather than constrained by fear. In the quiet of the night, Ibrahim knelt once more by the river, reflecting on the journey so far. The water flowed steadily beneath the ice, carrying reflections of the moon and stars. He thought of the children who had learned from him, the families he had assisted, and the small but powerful shift in attitudes among those who had once feared him. Change, he knew, was never sudden. It was cumulative, imperceptible at first, yet unstoppable over time. As he prayed under the emerging stars, Ibrahim felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. He understood that fear would always linger in some hearts, that prejudice could take generations to fully dissipate, and that challenges would continue to arise. Yet the foundations of trust, compassion, and understanding had been laid. Seeds had been planted deeply, nurtured by patience, resilience, and action. And these seeds, he knew, would grow in time, shaping not only the present, but the future of the village for generations to come. Spring had returned, once again painting the village with fresh shades of green and the soft colors of blooming flowers. The river, thawed from winter's grip, flowed freely, reflecting the bright sky and the renewed life of the village. The long months of fear, suspicion, and gradual understanding had left deep marks, but the transformation was now visible, undeniable, and lasting. Ibrahim walked through the village at dawn, his steps steady, observing the life around him. Children ran past, laughing freely, some carrying small bundles of herbs they had learned to cultivate under his guidance. Villagers worked together in the fields, repairing fences, tending crops, and caring for animals, simple acts, yet performed with a cooperative spirit that had rarely existed before his arrival. Even Thomas, the tavern keeper, watched from the edge of the square, his skepticism softened by the undeniable truth of what he had witnessed over the past seasons. Eliza approached him with a smile, carrying a basket of freshly baked bread and fruits from the garden. "Ibrahim," she said, her voice warm, "the village has changed. People no longer fear the unknown as they once did. They speak of you not in whispers of suspicion, but in admiration and gratitude." Ibrahim shook his head gently, humility in every movement. "It is not I who changed the village," he said softly. "It is the courage of those who chose to see, to learn, to act with understanding rather than fear. I only showed a path. They walked it themselves." Even Edward, the mayor, had begun to acknowledge the depth of Ibrahim's influence. At a council meeting, he admitted openly, "The village is stronger, healthier, and more united because of what we have witnessed. Fear will always linger, but understanding now guides more than it hinders. Ibrahim has shown us the way not through force, but through action." A final test of trust came unexpectedly. A neighboring village, still clinging to old prejudices, sent envoys warning that they should be wary of foreign influence. Fear, once a dominant force, threatened to creep back into the hearts of the villagers. But this time, the response was different. Leaders and families, strengthened by months of experience, spoke with measured calm. They recounted the months of aid, instruction, and compassion Ibrahim had provided. They spoke of the children learning, the sick healed, and the village thriving under his quiet guidance. Fear no longer dictated their actions, it was tempered by evidence, patience, and lived understanding. That evening, the villagers gathered for a communal celebration, honoring both the arrival of spring and the renewed unity of their community. Music, laughter, and the aroma of shared meals filled the air. Children danced freely near the river, and adults spoke openly with one another, their voices blending into a harmony previously impossible in a village long ruled by suspicion. Ibrahim stood quietly, observing, helping when needed, yet never imposing. Even Thomas approached, albeit hesitantly, placing a small gift of tools and herbs near Ibrahim's shelter. "I cannot say I fully understand everything you've done," he muttered, "but I see the good. I see it in what the village has become." Ibrahim accepted the gesture with a nod, understanding that trust, once earned, often arrived slowly and in its own time. Samuel, the young scholar, watched the scene with quiet satisfaction. The transformation was profound. Fear, once dominant, had given way to observation, experience, and understanding. The lessons Ibrahim embodied patience, compassion, integrity had not only survived, but thrived in the hearts of those who had chosen to see beyond prejudice. As twilight descended, Ibrahim knelt by the river, reflecting on the journey. The water flowed steadily, carrying the reflection of the stars above. The village had learned, slowly and patiently, that fear could be met with kindness, suspicion could be met with understanding, and prejudice could be overcome through consistent, compassionate action. The story of Ibrahim's time in the village became more than a tale of a foreigner living among strangers. It became a living example of how humanity could rise above fear, how faith could be practiced without imposing, and how change, though gradual, could transform communities profoundly. Under the quiet glow of the moon, Ibrahim prayed one final time for the night, not for himself, but for the villagers who had opened their hearts. The seeds he had planted, in soil and in spirit, would continue to grow, nurtured by actions rather than words, patience rather than force, and understanding rather than fear. And in that serene moment, the village, once bound by whispers of suspicion, stood united, hopeful and transformed, a testament to the enduring power of compassion, patience, and unwavering faith. The journey of mistrust to understanding had reached its moment of fulfillment. The village, the people, and even the hearts that had doubted had been forever changed. And Ibrahim, quietly steadfast, continued to embody the principles that had guided him from the very beginning: that fear can be met, prejudice can be challenged, and humanity can rise, one patient act at a time.